Shabbat Shalom. So several nights ago, we let our dog Benny out in the back, our little Shih Tzu. And Benny is out in the back, and all of a sudden Benny starts going crazy. He's barking, he's barking. Rebecca's in the kitchen. She lets Benny in. Benny comes in. Next thing we know, Eyal, our 7-year-old who had been asleep, calls down from the top of the stairs, Imanaba, what was that shaking? What are you talking about shaking? He says, I heard a big bang and the house was shaking. I said, go back to bed. You just heard the door close when we let the dog in. Shaking the house. I didn't feel any shaking of the house. Of course, what happens, I turn on my Facebook feed not long after that. The meteor. A flaming rock flew through the sky. It woke up the 7-year-old. I didn't even notice it. And so here we are in the midst of this week, and I'm at home reading about the Parsha in preparation for Shabbos. I'm studying the Parsha. And we are in the midst of the plagues. That's the narrative we're in the midst of right now. We're in the midst of the plagues, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, uh-oh, for the plague of rocks flaming through the air, for the plague of influenza, for the plague, history repeats itself. We are in the midst of the plagues, it feels like. Of course, what is the one difference? The plagues in ancient times, in ancient Egypt, the Jews were exempt from them. So if you think of the blood, you think of the darkness, you think of the hail, you think of the lice, etc., it didn't affect the Jews. But here we are, we're in the midst of the plagues. Anyway, everyone, keep your hands to yourself, no shaking, and watch out for meteors flying through the air. So it is that we turn to our Eitz Chaim Chumashim this morning, and you're welcome to turn with me if you will. I'm on page 382 and 383. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that God said to the Israelites that they should take a lamb for the slaughter on the 10th day of Nisan, and they keep it in their house for several days. And now it is on the 14th of that Hebrew month. They shall take some of the blood, on verse 7. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. Of course, we know we've got Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. We read about it every year at the Seder time, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. And then if you skip down several verses, I'm on page 383. God comes to explain, perhaps, why God requires us to put the blood on the doorpost. It's a strange thing, right? Here we've slaughtered a lamb, okay, and we take the blood and we put it on the doorposts, right, on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the house. Then God says, for that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, I the Lord. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So now my question to you is, God tells us that night, the 14th of Nisan, to take the blood from the lamb we just sacrificed and paint it on the doorposts and the lintels of our house. Why? So God will pass over, and we know from the movie The 10 Commandments, that's exactly what happened, right? And it says here, when I see the blood, I will pass over you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt, right? And the Hebrew word here, of course, is fasachti, I will pass over. Now, we don't really know what the word Pesach means. It's actually a fascinating conversation. What does the word Pesach mean? This is really among the only times it's used. Rashi comes to teach that the word Pesach means to skip over, right? So clearly we can see from this that our ancestors were living amongst their Egyptian neighbors. It was not a ghettoized community. They were living amongst their Egyptian neighbors, and in order for God to know which houses not to strike, they painted the lamb's blood on the door, and so God skipped over those houses. There are others who come to argue that no, the word Pesach actually means protection. So it's not that God is, literally skipping over, but that God protected those houses that had the lamb's blood on the door. Now, what's the problem with this? He's God. Exactly right. Does God need us to paint the doorposts because God's wondering which ones are the Jewish houses and which ones aren't? Right? Really, God needs the help? So there's some commentators who come to explain that God doesn't need the help. God knows which houses are Jewish. But because our ancestors had been part of the Egyptian milieu for 4 centuries, many of them had taken upon themselves idol worship. And so God needed to know which ones were ready to be free. And maybe not all the Israelites left Egypt at that time, only those who were willing and able to reject idolatry. And how do they demonstrate that to God? By painting the doorposts. Okay, pretty good? Did you buy the explanation? There's another explanation. If we look at the text, God says, I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, I the Lord. Well, what does that have to do with anything? There's a midrash that comes to say that the reason they painted lamb's blood on the doorpost, the reason they took the lamb on the 10th day of Nisan, the reason they sacrificed the lamb on the 14th day of Nisan, is because lamb was a central deity among the Egyptians. And not only that, but lamb was a zodiacal sign for the Egyptians. And God wanted the Israelites to say to their oppressors, I'm going to take your God, I'm going to slaughter it, and I'm going to paint it on the doorposts of my house. Right? Perhaps God wanted the Israelites to say to their Egyptian oppressors, you are no longer in control of me. And in fact, God is the only all-powerful deity. And as a result, they took not just any blood, they took lamb's blood and painted it on the doorposts of their house. And in that way, God meted out punishment to all the gods of Egypt. By that explanation? There's yet one more. Rambam, Maimonides. He comes to say, verse 13, Vayahadam lachem laot al habatim, and the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. Rambam comes to teach that it wasn't God who needed to know which houses were Jewish and which ones weren't. Rambam comes to teach that it wasn't that God was out to seek vengeance on the Egyptians and allow our ancestors to give them a what for as they were preparing to leave Egypt. But rather, the blood on the doorposts was a sign for us. So that when we looked upon the doorposts that night between slavery and freedom, we knew what our expectations were, because God wasn't just setting us free. God was setting us free in order to serve God. God wasn't just giving us freedom. Right? Let my people go that they may serve me, God says. So in that moment between slavery and freedom, God is requiring us to remember who we are and what our obligations are as a Jewish people. It's not just freedom. It's to recognize that in our freedom, we now have the opportunity to serve a higher cause, to serve a higher purpose. And of course, ever since that time, thousands of years ago, what do we now put on the doorposts of our house as a reminder? The mezuzah. The mezuzah is a reminder that even in the midst of our freedom, God has expectations of us. So I was thinking about that this week in our Parsha when I read in the newspaper about I think he was a Mexican man, deported, leaving his children, leaving his family, after 30 years, if I recall correctly, here in the United States. I was thinking about that when I read about the Albanian man who had been taking care of his wife, who had, I believe, MS, if I recall correctly. And now they are at the Central United Methodist Church downtown, the church acting as a sanctuary church. Sanctuary. And I was thinking to myself, what does that mean, and what would we do as a synagogue community? If someone walked through our doors with the mezuzah on the doorpost and said, I'm in search of sanctuary, will you provide it? It's not an easy question to answer. Because after all, the laws about illegal immigration, the laws about refugee status, all of these laws are meant to protect us. They're meant to keep us safe, whether from terrorism or from petty crime. And let's be honest, these laws about immigration are also about the economy. Jobs for Americans, and the government collecting its taxes. Though I just heard the government is shut down. I said, if a government shuts down in the middle of Washington, D.C. and no one's around to hear it, does it still make a noise? These laws are in place to protect us. These laws are in place for a reason, for a good reason. And in fact, if you spend any time on the various immigration websites that our government has set up, you'll actually see there is something like a dozen different humanitarian exceptions that one is allowed to apply for. I think a dozen humanitarian exceptions that if you take the time to do the paperwork, you take the time to submit the application, then theoretically, if you qualify, you get an exemption and you can stay here in the United States. And after all, as Jews, we know ever since the Talmudic era, Dina da Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law. As Jews, we follow the law of the land. And if the law of the land is no illegal immigrants, that's the law of the land. But we know that Dina da Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law. That halachic principle, that Jewish legal principle, only applies when it doesn't really cause us to come into conflict with our Jewish values. Because as we stand on the precipice between slavery and freedom, we had to paint the blood on the doorposts to remind us that we answer to a higher authority. To remind us that even in the midst of our freedom, we have an obligation to God and to all of God's children. I don't have an easy answer for us today. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't think it's a black and white issue. But in this week of Parashat Bo, when we see so many around us who fear the other, let us remember that our Torah tells us not once and not twice, but 36 times to remember that we were strangers once in the land of Egypt. And let us remember too, as our Parsha reminds us, and as the mezuzah on the doorposts of our house and our gates and our synagogue reminds us, we have to answer to a higher authority. This Shabbat of Parashat Bo, may we have the strength, may we have the wisdom to truly respond to that higher authority. And let us say together, Amen.